Welcome to the JanAire installation video. In order to install the JanAire, you'll need to use the following tools: a square, tin snips, level, 7/16 open-end wrench, 7/16 deep well socket wrench, 2 vice grips with padded grips, a drill, a utility knife, and a chalk line. The JanAire unit consists of a motor mount end panel, hose cover panel, 2 2-foot gutters, standard gutters. These gutters are 8 foot 1 inch in length, allowing for 1 inch of overlap, 2 polyvent blowers, return panel, front guides, standard end panel, standard front panel, 2 3-inch diameter by 3-foot black flex hoses, blower shroud, and blower shroud cap. When framing for the JanAire system, the end should be plumb if the barn is level, or square to the slope if the building slopes. Note that your bird barrier goes behind the frame. Begin the installation by centering the motor mount on the opening. Snap a line from the top of the motor mount the length of the opening. To save time, spread the gutters out in pairs the entire length of your JanAire unit. Next, install the top gutters. Have your assistant hold the top bend of the gutter on the chalk line and secure the gutter with 2 screws. Repeat this sequence the entire length of the JanAire system. To determine the level of the bottom gutter, use the standard end panel as a gauge. When fastening the bottom gutters, place a nylon spacer between the wood frame and the gutter. Note how the assistant swings the gutter so the spacer can be easily placed behind the gutter. Secure with 2 screws and continue this sequence the entire length of the building. Once all the gutters are installed, one person should go back and install the screws every 2 feet and then install the front guides. Front guides are installed at every splice and 4 feet between splices. Guides are installed on the outside of the gutters. There should be 6 inches of clearance for the poly bag between the bird barrier and the front guides. The 2x4 framing provides 1.5 inches. The gutters provide the remaining 4.5 inches. To ensure proper clearance, all the gutters and guides have slotted holes where they bolt together. If you need to increase the width of the frame, then spread the gutters apart. To decrease the width, move the gutters toward one another. While one person is installing the front guides, the other person can assemble the ends. Starting with the standard end panel, screw it to the 2x4 frame and bolt it to the top and bottom gutters. Note, flanges face outward. Using clamps, place the front panel in position and flush with the standard panel. Drill 3 holes in the front and end panels as shown. Drill a hole in the top and bottom gutters as shown. Bolts should be used to secure the front panel to the frame. Install the 2-foot gutters, top and bottom. Then install the return panel. Drill holes top and bottom to secure the panel to the standard gutters. Put 2.5 turns of the hose through the motor mount end panel. The motors are then bolted on the compressed hose back against the motor mount end panel. Note that the motor always faces toward the building. It's easier and faster to have the nuts on the inside of the motor mount end panel. These bolts are the only bolts that should ever protrude into the unit. Place the cap on the shroud cover and use 3 screws, 1 on both sides and 1 on the back to secure the cap to the shroud. Place the shroud over the motors, keeping it about 1 inch above the fan. Locate the hole in the top lid of the shroud cap that is closest to the wall. While holding the motor shroud assembly in position, drill a matching hole in the motor mount end panel. Place a bolt through the hole and secure in place with a lock washer and nut. Support the motor shroud in place with this bolt. With the hose cover clamped in position, drill 2 1/4 inch holes in the right side of the hose cover. Locate the slotted holes in the motor shroud. Drill through these slots. Hose cover panel and flanges in the motor mount panel. Using tin snips, create slots in the motor shroud and hose cover panel. Install cage nuts in the holes in the motor mount flange. Cut off the top corner of metal next to the return panel so the panel can pivot outwards. Remember to remove the protective covering before final assembly. Once the gutters and front guides are in place, the next step is installing the poly. To aid installation, it is recommended to insert a pipe through the roll and hold the ends up on a pair of sawhorses. Fold the poly over once and carefully pull the length of the vent. Note, always slide poly over the lap of the gutter and not into the lap. To place the gaskets for the blower seal, locate the top tube with air inlet decal. The gasket doesn't go on the decal, but about 5 inches from the edge of the tube. Once the outer gasket is installed, use a sharp utility knife and, catching only the top layer of poly, make an opening. You should place one hand on the back side of the poly when cutting. This way, you will feel the knife if it starts to prick through the second layer, allowing you to back the knife off. Undersize the opening about 1/4 inch, as this will help to create a better seal when the hose is inserted. Once your opening has been made, insert the inner gasket. The inner gasket is easier to work with if you bend it in on itself as shown. Once both gaskets are in place, you can use a stapler to hold them together. Repeat this procedure on the tube right below the special seal. To install the hoses into the poly, first bend down the wire on the end of this hose to prevent it from catching on the poly. Next, insert about 2½ ribs into the poly. Repeat for the lower hose. When inflating the poly for the first time, start with the top blower. Go along and help the poly vent up so that it doesn't twist. Once the top tubes are inflated, repeat this process for the bottom tubes. When the poly is properly installed and inflated, it should have an in-out pattern to the row of seals. You should be able to place your hand between the first and second tubes. The seal between the second and third tubes will be out toward the guides, similar to an accordion, with the first seals between the first and second tubes being towards the bird barrier. In this example, the fold pattern of the poly goes in, out, out. This makes one tube appear larger than the rest of the tubes. Correcting the fold pattern gives the poly an even appearance. Making sure the bottom tube is laying properly, with the tube toward the outside and the first row of the seals from the bottom facing towards the bird barrier and the building, will go a long ways in making the rest of the tubes take their proper pattern. Here's an example of how a poor in and out pattern affects the appearance of an installation. Yet, note this: if the bottom tube is laying properly, once the poly vent starts to cycle up and down, the rest of the polyvent can and usually will assume its correct pattern. To install the poly clamp option, you will use 2-foot extrusions of T-lock. The piece with the groove on one side is the base. Cut the two pieces in half and drill 2 1/4-inch holes in the base pieces. The bases should be installed in the gutter at an angle as shown. We are using a scrap piece of poly for demonstration purposes. Place the corner of the poly over the clamp as shown. Ensure that the poly doesn't cover the end of the clamp, as this will cause wear on the poly. Once the poly is properly positioned, place the top piece in the groove on the base and close securely by supporting the gutter with your knee and tamping down on the lock with the handle of a hammer. When assembling a JanAir stacked unit, it helps to snap lines where the center 2x4 will be mounted before installing the bird barrier. The entire frame is centered off the center 2x4. It really helps later on if the center 2x4 is straight to begin with. When framing for the JanAir system, the end should be plumb if the barn is level, or square to the slope if the building slopes. And note that the bird barrier goes behind the frame. Snap a line on the end so that your motor mount ends and the 3 gutters will all line up. Next, snap a line on the center 2x4 1.5 inches from the bottom. Secure center gutter to wood frame first. Line up bend with chalk line. Be sure to use nylon spacers every other hole. Mount both top and bottom motor mount ends. Mount top and bottom gutters using one of the standard ends as a gauge off of the center gutter. Make sure that when you are installing gutters that you always overlap the gutters the same way. The stacked units are basically the same as the standard units except for the center gutter and the 2-foot center gutter. The stacked units do require some field drilling in these locations. In high wind areas like in western Iowa, western Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Nebraska, there are times when the top corner of the poly may come out from behind the standard front panel on the drive end. To prevent this, JanAir has developed the wind retainer option. This option should be installed in extremely windy areas. Drill a 3/8 inch to 1/2 inch hole 3 inches from the end of the gutter, both top and bottom, on both ends of the frame. Slip 3 rings around the fiberglass rod and place the fiberglass rod in the end of the frame. Secure each fiberglass rod with hitch pins. Make 3/8 inch long slit into the poly tube right along the edge of the seal. Note, it is easier to do this while the poly is inflated. Push the slug into the poly, then center the slug to the hole. Fold the end seal toward the hole and slide the sleeve over the slug. Place an eye bolt through the hole in the sleeve and fasten with the nut. Now, join 2 cable ties together. Loop one end of the cable tie through a ring and the other end of the cable tie through the eye bolt. When you are finished, the poly should be centered in the JanAir frame. Again, the cable ties on the bottom poly on both ends of the poly should be fairly snug. The cable ties for the upper poly should be fairly slack, so as not to hinder the operation of the poly. On pole-type construction, the steel siding can be flashed over the flange at the top gutter and over the 1.5 inch flange on both ends of the unit. When steel is used below the bottom gutter on pole construction, replace the 2x4 normally used with a 2x6. This will allow you room to fasten the siding, then a double angle flashing, which keeps any moisture from getting behind the siding. Be sure to allow at least 1/4 inch gap below the polyvent gutters so that any moisture can get out. Let's compare installing the safety features of a polyvent and a regular cable-operated curtain. First, in case of a power outage, a conventional curtain can have a device called a curtain drop added to the unit. This device would allow the curtain drop to open so the animals inside the barn don't suffocate. Whereas, by design, the JanAir polyvent will begin to let fresh air enter into a barn as soon as the power goes off. What if a multi-stage master controller locks up? With a polyvent, a single-stage thermostat wired in line between the bottom polyvent blower and the controller solves the problem. Then, just set the temperature range on the thermostat slightly higher than the set point for the controller. With a conventional curtain, you would wire the thermostat to the curtain drop. We've talked about getting both systems to open up. What if you wanted to limit how much they would open? This conventional curtain opened when a cable broke. The amount it opened could have been limited with a tether. JanAir has a tether system also. A tether clip can be attached at 8-foot intervals. A tether clip consists of a sleeve, ring, rod, and nylon cording. Pierce the rod into the polytube at the fold line on the top. Center the rod under the entrance hole and slide the sleeve over the rod and lock it in place with the ring. Using a simple slip knot, the nylon cording can be attached to both the ring and one of the holes drilled in the top gutter. The attic air option provides a place for the fans on the polyvent to draw a clean, dry source of air, free of snow, wind-blown field dirt, and debris. Take off the standard shroud cover and replace it with a new shroud cover. Secure the standard shroud cover to the bottom of the motor shroud. Apply the gasket material to the 3 flanges. Cut out the inside corner of the bottom shroud cap for the fan cords to pass through. A 3-inch feed drop tube supplied by the installer carries the air from the soffit to the shroud. For barns with vented soffits, a 12-foot length of hose can be ordered from JanAir to extend the intake past a point where snow would normally blow into an attic. The filter shroud is primarily used on turkey barns to minimize the amount of feather and large pieces of litter that could get into the fans. Secure bottom in place with approved cover. Secure filter guide with gasket to one side and filter guide without gasket to the other side. Fasten top on with 4 screws. Slide in filter and secure with 1 screw through the side. Apply gasket to 3 flanges and mount appropriately. In some installations where there are 2 polyvents on the same wall, you might consider using our butted drive option. Here are some of the main points to consider when installing a butted drive option. Because of its design, the hose cover panels and the motor cover panels are screwed on in these locations. Hose cover panels go on first, with the motor cover going on over the top of the hose cover panel. With the motor cover off, there is plenty of room for your electrical connections. Also note that the 2-foot gutters have been replaced with gutters that are 66 inches in length. Notice also that if you would like to draw air from the attic, a 3-inch diameter hole is provided in one of the gutters, which will accept a 3-inch outside diameter feed drop tube. If you are not going to draw air from the attic, install a 66-inch gutter with a hole in it on the bottom of the unit. Just like the standard units, you will have to drill 1/4 inch holes and bolt the ends of the return panels. Framing for the butted units only requires that your vertical 2x4s have a dimension of 24 inches outside to outside. In some installations, such as this one on a holding area, what would normally be operated by one drive gets divided. In this case, the position of an overhead door left a short run of polyvent. Rather than using a complete drive unit to operate this short run of polyvent, air was plumbed to it in a 2-inch Schedule 40 PVC pipe. Because of the position of the door track on the inside of the building, the pipe was run on the outside of the building. Normally, the PVC pipe would be run on the inside of the building. First, notice that a 20-inch wide opening is made in the bird barrier. Second, the bird barrier is wrapped around the framing so that there are no sharp edges to snag the poly or the hoses. Third, one hose is attached to the top tube of the poly, and the other hose is attached to the tube right below the special seal. Fourth, the hoses can be clamped directly to the bell on the end of an elbow, or a coupling can be added to the end of a straight pipe. The increased diameter makes it easier to attach the hose. Fifth, use hose clamps to secure the hoses to the pipe. Notice that the polyvent doesn't go flat even with this much air loss. Remember to position the plumbing as to allow the full movement of the hoses and poly. Bird barrier should be added to the back side of the opening if the installation is to be bird-proof, or a plywood cover can be made if it's on an area where cattle can get at it. One feature of a polyvent is its ability to seal up tight in the winter. The only place any air can get around a polyvent is on the ends. In farrowing barns, nurseries, wean finishers, and other applications, the amount of air coming in around the ends can be controlled in two ways. One way, shown here, is to run the polyvent frame past the opening in your building. When doing this, always run the bird barrier past the opening also. The other way is to make a foam panel which is inserted between the last studs in the winter and removed in the summer. Getting the right length replacement poly is as easy as measuring the length of the existing frame from the outside edge of steel to the outside edge of steel. To determine the length of the frame to order on a new installation requires that you take a few things into consideration. A. Know the actual length of the opening and then add the width of the two 2x4s framing members on each end. B. Decide whether you want to run past the opening in the building 1 foot or 2 foot on each end. C. Will there be enough room beyond the drive end of the frame to accommodate the fans? Be sure to allow yourself 12 inches of clearance beyond the end of the frame for the blower shroud. Example, if you order a 100-foot JanAir unit, when this unit is installed, the overall length of it will be 101 feet. Each polyvent unit that is shipped out includes a small roll of polypatch tape. Keep it stored in a cool, dry place out of the sun. Occasionally during installation or afterwards, a small hole could be torn in the poly. Pinholes don't matter, but if the hole is an inch or two in diameter or it is a slit that is 1 or 2 inches in length, you can patch it. First, make sure the poly is clean and dry. If the poly is dirty, use water to dampen a cloth and then add some alcohol to the cloth and clean the area to be patched. Second, using more tape